Ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R. Church.
On the front cover of the April 27, 1998 Time magazine, there is a picture of a proposed Omni card. It looks like the American dollar squeezed down into plastic. And the main title on the Time magazine, The Future of Money. Inside this magazine is an article on one world banking. And the questions are asked: what the big mergers mean? Are banks really necessary? And will Microsoft control it all? Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me one world banking.
And J.R., this is a biblical topic if there ever was a biblical topic. This topic runs all the way through the Bible. We find an amazing correspondence between this article in Time magazine and what the Bible has to say about certain men whom it deems as quote-unquote merchants. And when the Bible talks about merchants, it's really talking about large-scale controlling entities, controlling goods, traffic, and money.
Such as the merchant bankers.
Merchant bankers.
You know, Gary, this idea on the future of money is really ominous.
Yes, it is.
Probably most of the folks who watched the news recently about the mergers of the big banks really don't understand the importance of it. And on today's program, we hope to be able to put it all into focus for you so that you can see where we stand in the scheme of things as the world is moving toward the development of the mark of the beast. So stay with us. This is very complicated and very important for you to understand. Let's begin with what the article called the Big Bank Theory. That's kind of a swing title there from the Big Bang Theory.
Big Bang Theory. Well, the banks are merging, and they feature the work of one very dynamic man. His name is Hugh McCall, and you may never have heard of him. He works behind the scenes to enact mergers. And he's a banker by trade, stays behind the scenes. And back in the 60s, according to this article, McCall used to work for a bank, and he talked about the potential of banking at that time. And according to the article, when he did, he, quote, did not talk about money at all. He talked about power, end quote. And J.R., that's what all this is really about.
Yes.
It's about power and control rather than money.
Well, you know, the bankers are going to have to do something because there are people who've come out of the woodwork over the past generation who have become billionaires today, namely Bill Gates and his types with computers and with technology industries that are really running off and leaving these bankers unless these bankers get a hold on things.
That's right, and the bankers have the potential to do just that. I want to present just a few simple figures. For example, Citicorp Travelers, in the recent merger you may have read about in the papers, resulted in a corporation of close to, within just a few dollars, of $700 billion. That's $750 billion. Nations Bank, Bank America merged, or that is, the merger is all but complete now, $572 billion. That's $500 billion. Chase Manhattan, $365 billion. J.P. Morgan, $262 billion. Bank One First Chicago, $230 billion. Together, J.R., these total to about $2.2 trillion in assets. That's on the positive side of the ledger, $2.2 trillion, as opposed to the United States of America, which has a negative balance of $5 trillion. In other words, the U.S. is $5 trillion in debt. These new corporate entities are $2.2 trillion on the plus side. Guess who's going to control what?
Well, if you have that kind of money, how many presidents can you elect?
Every single one, as a matter of fact.
That's right, and all of the politicians.
And by the way, if Mr. Bill Gates and his technical geniuses come up with ways of producing wealth, and they're suddenly rampaging out of control, and by the way, are a threat to this cabal of power-mad, let's say multi-trillionaires.
Yeah, the banking cartel.
The banking cartel. If Bill Gates happens to be a threat to them, guess what happens to Bill Gates?
Squish him.
They squish him, and we may be witnessing that right now.
Our government is going after him. No sooner do they complete one investigation till they announce the beginning of another investigation of Bill Gates and Microsoft. And you know, your head just spins. Why is the government going after this nice-looking guy? You know, who seems so laid back and easy to get along with. And why is our government just chomping after him? Because he's just too big.
And it's all about power. Don't forget that. It's not about money, although you can translate money figures into power. Now, in the world, the largest corporations are as follows. Citicorp Travelers, we mentioned $700 billion. The Bank of Tokyo, Mitsubishi, $648 billion. The Swiss bank, Credit Suisse, is $595 billion. Deutsche Bank, Germany, $575 billion, and Nations Bank, Bank America, $572 billion. Add those all up, you come to a net worth of just a little over $3 trillion. That's on the plus side of the ledger, and this translates into power, authority, kingmakers, people who get people elected.
Years ago, I used to think that the mark, the German mark, might have something to do with the coming mark of the beast because of the similarities in the name. But you know, I heard a few days ago on the news that Germany's mark may be soon obsolete, just completely going out of existence as Europe, and especially Germany, opt for the euro currency, the new European currency, which is coming in just a matter of weeks now. As this is really fascinating to live at this particular time in world history when the banking industry is making such major changes.
Now, when we've talked about one world currency in the past, we've talked about the currency of governments. United States currency has been held high as a candidate, as J.R. said. The Deutschmark has been held high as a candidate, and then of late the ECU of the European Currency Unit has been held high as a possible candidate for the universal money. But let's introduce a new topic here. And maybe it's none of the above. It could be private banking currency.
Yes.
E-cash is big, big, big. Electronic cash. And guess who would back that electronic cash? The international banking cartel.
Yeah. And I would suppose the credit cards and the various bank cards that are being set up and established, creating money outside of and apart from the United States dollar. That all they have to do is change the name of it whenever they get ready to, you know.
Sure.
Now, after the stock market crash of 1929, our politicians put together some restraints upon banking. For example, they said no branch banking allowed. And they said we're going to have state banks as well as national banks. But you know, Gary, they got rid of the state banks.
Yes, they did.
And they're putting branch banking up everywhere. Here around Oklahoma City, almost on every corner, more banks than there are filling stations. And that's the truth.
It could be, J.R., the electronic cash could replace your paper cash, your credit cards, your ATM card, your ID card, such as your little Social Security card, even maybe your driver's license. Your insurance card could be replaced because let's face it, these bank mergers also include insurance company holdings and even your very life, the mortgage on your home, on your vehicle, perhaps even college tuition. Everything rolled into one card, your whole life. And the time writers say, enter electronic cash. The idea of digital money is simple enough. Instead of storing value on paper, find a way to wrap it in a string of digits. And then they add, for starters, so you can send money over the internet encoded in an email instead of sending a check. This saves you the trouble of balancing a checkbook at the end of the month. And they go on and they say, and I'm quoting, your daughter can store the money any way she wants. on her laptop computer, on a debit card, even in the not too distant future, on a chip implanted under her skin. And I'm quoting Time magazine.
That's incredible. That's incredible stuff. Makes your goose pimples pop up all over you.
Oh,
you know?
It does, J.R.
If you understand what the Bible has to say about the end time, if you understand what the prophets have said, and this matter of eschatology, the doctrine of last things, knowing that the next millennium is just around the corner, Gary, this is really great stuff when you get down to it. For the believer in Christ, for the Christian, to know that the devil and his machinations, his planning, is preparing the world for the mark of the beast. And when you talk about these wealth accounts, which we're going to talk more about in just a moment, we're really talking about a person enslaved.
Absolutely, no question.
We'll be back in just a moment. The framers of our Constitution gave total control of issuing currency to our Congress. However, in recent years, merchant bankers have begun to make inroads into the ability of our nation to issue its own currency. With the establishment of the Federal Reserve System back in the early years of this century, we can see the international banking cartel taking over control of money. We still have United States currency written upon our dollar bills. However, one of these days, there is a possibility that the banks themselves will issue their own money. In fact, this article says that much, doesn't it, Gary?
It really did. It does. It talks about the fact that because of their net worth, the money that they would print would actually be backed by a more solid and stable net worth than that printed by our own government.
Especially if our national debt was $5 trillion and they have a couple of $2.5 trillion sitting in the vault.
Yeah, which one would you rather have? I think I'd rather have the money backed by like $2.5 trillion.
And I have a feeling, Gary, that it was planned this way. You know, they didn't just say, "Oh, look at that." Well, you poor politicians, you've done a bad job of governing, and meanwhile, we've been astute in our banking system, and Gary, it smells. It really smells.
As a matter of fact, this is where the future meets the past, because as you study the Bible, you often discover that you can go back into ancient history and discover the foundation of something you see today, and thus it is with banking. In the story of Hiram, king of Tyre, we find the original merchant, vastly wealthy man. He had ships running all over the civilized world. They would sail around the Mediterranean. They would sail out through the Straits of Gibraltar, as they're called today, up to as far north as northern Europe. And the Baltic areas, as far south as Africa, all the way east around India and China, Malaysia, and even as far west as North and South America. There are records of Phoenician trading ships from Tyre even sailing up the Amazon to what is now Peru today. And so the king of Tyre had a merchant fleet running everywhere. And because he had this fleet, he had to master a system of accounting. Because you got enormous quantities of grain and oil and wine and everything you can, silk, you name it, glass, gold, silver, and you've got to keep an account of it some way. And so this mercantile system was developed back in the days of Solomon by the king of Tyre.
And Solomon wrote to the king of Tyre and asked him, he said, I need some cedars from Lebanon cut down, and I need this and that and the other in order to build the temple. And he essentially said, Hiram, how much you want? And Hiram said, well, we'll figure this in grain instead of gold. And so he knew that they needed grain instead of gold at that particular time, and that was the price he set upon it. He was very sharp, Businessman.
A businessman. He was called
Merchant banker. I guess.
a merchant banker. And as a matter of fact, when you begin to study merchants in the Old Testament, and we don't have time to touch upon them all, but maybe the best place to start is Ezekiel 27. The whole chapter is a lamentation by the prophet against the king of Tyre because of his greed, because of his the desire of he and his progeny to control the lives and the wealth of men with whom they traded.
And so Ezekiel makes these merchants of Tyre and the offspring of Hiram and his merchant banking system a type of the future Mystery Babylon.
Exactly, and when you come to Ezekiel 27:25, you have this: the ships of Tarshish did sing of thee in thy market, and thou wast replenished and made very glorious in the midst of the seas. But J.R., the end of it comes at the end of verse 27. In that day you shall fall into the midst of the seas, the day of thy ruin, speaking of the final collapse of the system of merchant banking. And we read about that in Revelation 18.
Now, a few years later comes along Jezebel.
Yeah.
About what, 49, 50 years after Hiram?
Yeah, about, let's say 50 years after Hiram, we have the story of a weak king, Ahab, son of Omri, who was an evil king. And Ahab was a spineless, I guess in the parlance of the 20th century, we would call him a man of no integrity, a gutless wonder. And he wanted to build his palace, his ivory palace in Samaria, and he didn't have the nerve or the money, but he did have one thing. He knew the king of Tyre. He knew that whole family. And he arranged a marriage with the daughter of Ethbaal, who was a son, a great-great-great-grandson of the king of Tyre. Jezebel was her name. She was a powerful woman, wealthy. She was a priestess of Astarte, that is, she was a priestess of the fertility goddess cult, and she brought with her enormous wealth tied to Tyre. And so the kingdom of Ahab and Jezebel becomes really a model, J.R., for this kind of merging of government with banking.
It's interesting that in the book of the Revelation, Jezebel seems to capture the world. She becomes the type of the future Mystery Babylon, and eventually is thrown into great tribulation,
exactly,
as the scripture puts it. Well, we have the story of Hiram and Jezebel. It's kind of interesting that the modern banking cartel, worldwide banking cartel, appears to be the ultimate fulfillment of these ancient people. And one of the interesting things about today's banking and today's currency is that it is moving toward not just banking, but merchandising.
Exactly.
You remember back the RTC back in the 1980s when so many savings and loans would belly up.
That's right.
And they took over the various buildings. Well, they didn't want to keep the buildings, so they sold them off for pennies on the dollars. And the interesting thing about it is this future banking is going to market these buildings. In other words, it's not just going to be a banking system and we're just strictly bankers and we don't get involved in merchandising. I think people like Bill Gates and the new billionaires of this generation have caused these people to rethink their situation.
Indeed, and we have here a statement in this Time article concerning a vision of future finance, which would include the mortgage you hold on your house, the items you've charged on your credit card. It would be a super portfolio of your entire life called a wealth account, not simply to be understood as money or a stock or a bond, but an instrument, as they say, designed to match your financial needs with the available options. In other words, your wealth would become their management.
Yes. Now, you know, Gary, in the past, up until today, a man can mortgage a car, and if he defaults, only the car is taken. mortgage his house. If it defaults on, the house is taken.
Right.
But under this new system proposed in this Time magazine article, Gary, if you default on one thing, they can take everything you've got, right down to the socks out of your bureau drawer.
Indeed.
And put you out on the street. Talk about slavery. That's incredible.
It's enslavement to a system of power. And don't forget that Hugh McCall, one of the engineers of this system, said it's not really about money, it's about power. And you know, when you read Revelation 18 and this whole list of things, by the way, that are bought and sold by the merchants of Tarshish in their final state, they sell everything from gold and wood and silver and precious stone to the souls of men.
Wow.
Now that's
says it all, doesn't it?
It says it all. In other words, they own you lock, stock, and barrel.
How soon is this coming? It's coming soon enough for you and I, if we, shall we say, for those who are not saved, in our lifetime, it's just around the corner.